I found out the young woman I once welcomed into my home wanted to carry my husband's child, and I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I simply poured myself a cup of coffee and let it go cold in my hands as I watched the morning light stretch across the kitchen table we had shared for 40 years, because after that moment, nothing in my life felt familiar anymore, not the man I married at 27, not the house we built room by room, not even the quiet routine that had once made me feel safe. And as I sat there, I realized the betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic the way people imagine. It was quiet, almost polite, hidden in small changes I had ignored for months, like the way Richard started taking his phone outside when it rang or how he smiled at messages he never explained. And I remember thinking back to when Emily first came into our lives, how she stood at my front door holding a folder and a nervous smile, asking for guidance, saying she didn't have anyone else she could trust. And I had believed her. I had invited her in, offered her tea, listened to her stories about starting over, and somewhere along the way, she became a familiar presence, someone who sat at my table, someone who laughed at my husband's stories just a little too long, though at the time I told myself it was harmless, because that's what you do when you've built a life on trust, you protect it, even from your own doubts. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you refuse to look at it, it waits, patiently, until the moment you can't look away. And for me that moment came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I reached for Richard's tablet to check a recipe and a message appeared on the screen, just a single line that didn't belong in my world, something about timing, about starting fresh, about a future that didn't include me, and I didn't need to read more to understand what had been happening behind my back, because suddenly every small detail I had dismissed rearranged itself into something undeniable, every late errand, every distracted glance, every unexplained absence forming a pattern so clear it felt almost deliberate. And yet even then, I didn't confront him, I didn't call Emily, I didn't break anything or raise my voice, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that reacting too soon would mean losing control, and I had no intention of being the woman who gets pushed out of her own life without a say. So instead I stood there in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and I made a decision that would change everything. I would watch, I would listen, and I would wait. Because if they thought they could rewrite my life without me noticing, they had already made their first mistake. I did not touch his tablet again after that day, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I no longer needed confirmation. The truth had already settled into the quiet corners of my mind, and from that moment on, I began to notice everything with a kind of clarity that only comes when illusion finally breaks. The way Richard adjusted his tie before leaving the house even when he had nowhere formal to go, the way he started using a different cologne I had never bought him, something sharper, unfamiliar, and how he began to leave earlier in the mornings, always with the same vague explanation that sounded rehearsed, and I simply nodded each time, offering the same gentle smile I had given him for decades, because he expected me to remain exactly as I had always been, predictable, trusting, unaware, and I let him believe that. I let them both believe that, because there is power in being underestimated, especially by those who think they already know you. And Emily, she continued to visit, just as she always had, walking through my front door with that soft voice and careful manners, asking me how I was doing, complimenting the house, sitting across from me as if nothing in the world had changed, and I watched her closely now, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, as if I were studying someone I had never truly met before. I noticed the way her eyes drifted toward Richard when she thought I was not looking. The way their conversations carried a subtle rhythm, too smooth, too practiced, and once, as she stood by the kitchen counter, her phone lit up in her hand and I saw his name reflected faintly on the screen, just for a second, but it was enough. And still, I said nothing. I poured more coffee, asked her about her plans, listened as she spoke about the future in vague, hopeful terms, and I realized then that whatever they were building did not include me, not even as a memory worth honoring, and that understanding did not break me the way it might have years ago. Instead it steadied me. It gave me direction, because if they were planning a life without me, then I would make sure that life came at a cost they had not considered, so I began to prepare in small, careful steps. I gathered documents I had not looked at in years, reviewed accounts, read through agreements that once felt like formalities but now revealed their true importance, and I made a call one afternoon while Richard was out, a simple conversation with someone who understood exactly what I needed without me having to explain too much, and when I hung up, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but control, the kind that comes quietly, without announcement. And that evening, when Richard returned home and asked what I had done all day, I looked at him and smiled, the same way I always had, and I said nothing at all. The next morning felt no different on the surface, and that was exactly what I wanted. The same routine, the same quiet breakfast, the same sound of the coffee maker filling the kitchen with a steady hum. And Richard sat across from me reading the news on his phone as if nothing in our life had shifted, as if the foundation we had built over 4 decades had not already begun to crack beneath his feet. And I studied him in a way I never had before, not as a wife searching for comfort, but as someone measuring distance, noting patterns, observing without attachment. And it was strange how quickly affection can turn into something else when trust disappears. Not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of clarity that leaves no room for illusion. And I realized then that he had already stepped out of our marriage long before I discovered it. He had simply waited for me to catch up to the truth. And later that afternoon, when he left the house claiming he had errands to run, I did not ask questions. I simply watched him through the window until his car disappeared at the end of the street, and then I moved, not in a rush, not in panic, but with intention. I opened the drawer where we kept our shared documents, the ones we had signed together over the years without much thought, insurance papers, property records, account statements, and for the first time, I read every line as if it mattered. Because now it did. Every number, every name, every clause carried weight. And I began to see the structure of our life not as something emotional, but as something built on decisions. And decisions could be changed, redirected, protected. And as I worked through each document, I made quiet notes, small adjustments, careful steps that would not raise suspicion. And when Emily arrived that evening, unannounced but no longer unexpected, I greeted her the same way I always had, with warmth, with calm, offering her a seat at the table she had slowly learned to claim as familiar. And she spoke about her day, about plans that sounded ordinary on the surface, but now I could hear what was not being said, the pauses, the careful choice of words, the way she avoided certain details as if she were protecting something fragile. And I let her talk. I let her feel safe, because people reveal more when they believe they are in control. And at one point, she mentioned the future again. This time with a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone uncertain, and I understood then that whatever they were planning was no longer hypothetical, it was already in motion. And still, I did not confront her, I did not challenge a single word. Instead I nodded, I listened, and I memorized everything, because the truth was no longer something I needed to uncover, it was something I was preparing to use. And that night, after she left and the house returned to its usual silence, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at the life I had built piece by piece. And I realized I was not losing it, not yet, not if I chose otherwise. And for the first time since that message appeared on the screen, I felt something steady take hold inside me, not hope, not forgiveness, but control, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. And I knew then that when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice to be heard. By the end of that week, I had learned more about my own life than I had in the past 10 years, not because anything new had happened, but because I had finally started paying attention to the details I once trusted without question, and it was in those details that everything revealed itself. The shared calendar Richard kept on his phone that suddenly included blocks of time labeled only as meetings, the receipts tucked carelessly into his jacket pocket from places he never mentioned, and the subtle but undeniable shift in the way he spoke to me, polite, distant, almost rehearsed, as if he were already practicing a life where I no longer belonged. And I let it continue. I let the silence stretch between us without filling it, because silence has a way of exposing what words try to hide. And one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he mentioned that he might need to travel for a few days, something about an opportunity that required his attention, and I nodded as I served his plate, asking no questions, offering no resistance, because I already knew the answer before he finished the sentence. And later that night, after he had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen once again, the same place where everything had begun to unravel, and I opened my notebook, the one I had started keeping since that Tuesday afternoon, and I wrote down every detail I had observed, every date, every time, every inconsistency, not out of obsession, but out of purpose, because patterns matter, and patterns become proof when the time comes to be heard without raising your voice. And the next morning, I made another call, this time longer, more deliberate, asking questions I had never imagined needing to ask, listening carefully to answers that reshaped my understanding of what was possible. And when I hung up, I felt the final piece settle into place, not emotionally, but practically, as if I had been building something quietly in the background and now it was ready to stand on its own. And that afternoon, Emily returned again, her presence now almost routine, and as she stepped into the house, she smiled at me with the same Softness she had always used, but there was something different beneath it now, something more certain, as if she believed she had already secured her place in a future that did not include me, and I welcomed her in, offered her coffee, and watched as she moved through the space with a familiarity that no longer felt accidental. And when she spoke about plans, about stability, about what she called new beginnings, I listened without interruption, because I understood something she did not, that beginnings built on deception rarely end the way people expect, and as she sat there across from me, speaking with quiet confidence, I realized she was not my enemy in the way I once might have thought. She was simply part of a decision my husband had already made, and that distinction mattered, because it meant my response would not be driven by emotion, but by clarity. And that night, as I turned off the lights and walked through the house that still legally belonged to both of us, I did not feel like I was being pushed out. I felt like I was preparing to step aside on my own terms, and there is a difference between losing something and choosing how you leave it, and I intended to make that difference undeniable the day he said he was leaving for that short trip. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the house before it changed. I walked through each room slowly, noticing the small things I had once taken for granted, the way the floor creaked near the hallway, the faint mark on the wall where we had measured time in quiet pencil lines, the kitchen window that caught the morning sun just right, and I realized none of it belonged to the version of me that had been living here without question. That version had already disappeared the moment I chose to see the truth, and when Richard came downstairs with his suitcase, he looked almost relieved, as if this temporary absence was something he had been waiting for, something that made his choices easier. And I stood there, calm, composed, asking him if he had everything he needed, my voice steady, my expression unchanged, because I was not interested in stopping him, not anymore. And as he walked out the front door, he turned back briefly, not with guilt, not with hesitation, but with a kind of polite acknowledgement, the same kind you give to someone you believe will remain exactly where you left them. And I closed the door behind him without a word, listening to the quiet settle into the house once again. And that was the moment everything shifted from preparation to action. I did not wait. I did not hesitate. I moved through the plan I had built step by step, making calls, confirming details, signing what needed to be signed, each decision deliberate, each choice grounded in clarity rather than emotion. And by the time the afternoon light filled the living room, the life he thought he could return to had already begun to change in ways he could not see. And later that evening, my phone lit up with a message, not from him, but from her, simple, casual, asking if I was doing all right, as if concern could still exist between us. And I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning, but recognizing the quiet confidence behind it, the assumption that I would remain unaware, unchanged. And I set the phone down without responding, because there was nothing left to say, not yet, and instead I sat at the table with my notebook open in front of me, reviewing everything one last time, every document, every detail, every step I had taken to ensure that when the moment came, I would not need to argue. I would not need to explain, I would simply act. And as the evening turned into night, I felt no urgency, no panic, only a steady sense of control that had replaced everything else. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without interruption, not because the situation had improved, but because I knew exactly what I was going to do next. And more importantly, I knew that when he came back, he would not be walking into the same life he had left behind. He returned 3 days later, just as he said he would, pulling into the driveway with the same routine ease, as if nothing had shifted beneath him, as if time had paused in his absence and waited for him to step back into place. And I watched from the kitchen window again, not with anticipation, not with anxiety, but with a quiet awareness of how much had already changed without him noticing. And when he walked through the front door, he greeted me the same way he always had, placing his keys on the counter, offering a casual smile, asking if everything had been all right while he was gone. And I nodded, telling him it had been peaceful, which was true in a way he would never fully understand, because peace, I had learned, does not always come from comfort. Sometimes it comes from clarity. And as he moved through the house, setting his suitcase aside, loosening his tie, stepping back into the rhythm he believed was still intact, I continued preparing dinner, the same quiet routine, the same measured movements, but everything beneath the surface had shifted, and he did not see it, not yet. And that was the part that mattered most, because when people believe nothing has changed, they reveal themselves without hesitation. And over the next hour, he spoke about his trip in vague, surface details, careful not to offer too much, careful not to invite questions. And I listened without interrupting, not because I believed him, but because I no longer needed to challenge him. the truth was no longer something I was trying to uncover, it was something I was waiting to present. And later that evening, his phone lit up on the table between us, and for a brief second, he hesitated before reaching for it, but I had already seen the name, and he quickly turned the screen away, excusing himself with a soft explanation that did not quite land, and I simply nodded, continuing to clear the dishes, because the moment for confrontation had already passed, and what remained was something far more precise. And as the night settled in and he went upstairs, I stayed behind, sitting at the table with the same stillness that had carried me through the past days, and I looked at the space around me, at the life that had once felt shared and now felt divided in ways he could not yet see, and I realized that the final step was not about exposing what he had done, it was about deciding what I would no longer accept. And the next morning, I followed through on that decision, not with a dramatic announcement, not with raised voices or accusations, but with actions that spoke clearly on their own, changes that would only become visible when it was too late to undo them. And when he eventually noticed, when the structure he depended on no longer responded the way it always had, I knew he would look at me for answers, but by then, I would not need to explain anything at all. It began with something so small he almost missed it, a notification from the bank that did not match what he expected, a routine check that no longer returned the same familiar numbers, and I saw it in his face before he even said a word, that brief flicker of confusion, the quiet recalculation happening behind his eyes as he tried to make sense of something that had always been certain. And I continued pouring my coffee as if nothing had changed, as if the morning was just another morning, because for me, it was. I had already walked through the uncertainty, already made peace with what needed to be done, and now I was simply watching the result unfold. And he cleared his throat, casually at first, asking if I had moved some funds, if I had paid something he did not know about, his tone careful, measured, not yet accusatory, and I looked at him with the same calm expression I had carried for weeks and told him that I had taken care of a few things, nothing more, nothing less. And that was when the silence between us shifted, no longer empty, but filled with something new, something he could not control. And over the next few days, more of those small moments appeared. Access that no longer worked the way it used to, decisions that had been made without his input, structures he relied on quietly adjusting beyond his reach, and each time, he grew a little less certain, a little more aware that something fundamental had changed. And still, I did not explain, because explanations are given when there is something left to negotiate, and I had already moved past that point. And one afternoon, as he stood in the living room holding a document he clearly did not expect to see, he finally asked the question he had been avoiding, not directly, not fully, but enough, asking what exactly was going on. And I met his gaze without hesitation, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a clarity he had not seen from me before. And I told him that everything was exactly as it should be, that I had simply taken responsibility for what was mine. And that answer did not satisfy him, I could see that, but it was not meant to. It was meant to mark the boundary he had crossed without realizing it. And that evening, when his phone rang again and he stepped outside to answer it, I did not need to hear the conversation to understand its urgency, because now the uncertainty had reached beyond me. Now it was something he had to explain to someone else. And when he came back inside, his composure was different, less assured, more careful, and for the first time since this began, he looked at me not as someone predictable, but as someone he no longer fully understood. And I realized then that the balance had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through force, but through quiet, deliberate action. And as I stood there in the same house that had once felt like it was slipping away from me, I understood something simple and undeniable. I had not lost control of my life. I had taken it back piece by piece, and now, finally, he was beginning to see it. By the next week, the house had changed in ways that could not be ignored, not because anything looked different on the surface, but because the structure beneath it no longer responded the way it once had. And Richard moved through each day with a growing hesitation, checking things twice, asking questions he had never needed to ask before. And I could see the quiet tension settling into him, the realization that something he had taken for granted was no longer certain. And still, I kept everything calm, every movement deliberate, every word measured, because disruption does not always need to be loud to be effective. And one afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, he stood in the doorway holding his phone, his expression tighter than before, and he asked if I had spoken to anyone recently about our finances, about our accounts, about anything that might explain what he was seeing. And I paused for a moment, placing a neatly folded shirt on the stack beside me, and I told him that I had simply reviewed what was already mine, that I had made sure everything was in order, and that answer lingered in the space between us longer than he expected, because it was not something he could easily dismiss or argue against, and for the first time, he did not respond right away. He just stood there, trying to piece together a reality that no longer aligned with his assumptions. And later that evening, I noticed something else shift. Something more subtle but far more telling. He did not take his phone outside. When it rang, he stayed inside, speaking in a lower voice, as if distance alone could not guarantee privacy anymore. And I understood that whatever confidence he once had was beginning to unravel, not because I had exposed anything, but because I had changed the rules without announcing it. And a few days later, Emily returned, her presence still composed, still careful, but no longer as effortless as before. And when she stepped into the house, she glanced around for just a moment longer than usual, as if sensing that something beneath the surface had shifted, even if she could not yet name it. And I greeted her with the same calm I had always shown, offering her a seat, pouring her coffee, maintaining the routine she had grown comfortable with. And as she spoke, her words carried a slightly different tone now, less certain, more cautious, as if she were testing the space rather than assuming it belonged to her. And I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, simply observing. Because the truth was already moving toward them, slowly, steadily, without the need for confrontation. And that night, after she left and the house returned to its quiet stillness, Richard finally sat across from me with a question he could no longer avoid, asking me directly what I had done, what had changed. And I met his gaze without hesitation, not with anger, not with explanation, but with a simple, steady answer. I told him that I had only done what I should have done a long time ago. And I let that sentence settle, because sometimes the most powerful response is the one that leaves everything else unsaid. And as I stood up from the table and walked away, I knew he understood something in that moment, not everything, not yet, but enough to realize that the life he thought he could quietly replace was no longer waiting for him to decide its future. The next morning carried a different kind of silence, not the calm stillness I had grown familiar with, but something heavier, something that pressed into every corner of the house, and I could feel it even before I stepped out of the bedroom, because uncertainty has a way of filling spaces that certainty once occupied. And when I walked into the kitchen, Richard was already there, standing by the counter with his phone in his hand, not scrolling, not typing, just holding it as if it might offer him an answer he had not yet found. And when he looked up at me, there was no attempt to soften his expression this time, no casual tone, no practiced normalcy, just a directness that had been building for days. And he asked me again what I had done, but this time there was no distance in the question, no careful phrasing. It was clear, immediate, and I could see that he was no longer asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he had run out of explanations that made sense. And I took a slow breath, setting my coffee cup down with the same steady control I had maintained through everything. And I told him that I had secured what belonged to me, that I had made decisions based on reality rather than assumptions, and that nothing I had done was sudden. It had simply been invisible to him until now. And for a moment, he said nothing, his eyes searching my face as if trying to find the version of me he understood, the version that would explain, justify, or soften what was happening. But that version was no longer there. And as that realization settled in, something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that he understood this was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was a change that had already taken place. And later that day, I noticed him making calls he had not made before, speaking in a lower voice, asking questions that suggested he was trying to regain control over something that had already moved beyond him. And I did not interrupt. I did not listen closely, because I did not need to. The outcome of those conversations would not change what had already been set in motion. And in the afternoon, Emily's name appeared again on his screen. But this time, he did not answer right away. He stared at it for a few seconds longer than usual, as if weighing something he had not needed to consider before. And when he finally did answer, his tone was different, less assured, more cautious. And I realized that whatever version of the situation he had presented to her was beginning to unravel as well, because control, once lost, does not stay contained to one place. It spreads, it exposes, it forces everything into the open without a single word being spoken. And that evening, when the house grew quiet again, I sat by the window, looking out at the same view that had once felt like a backdrop to a life I thought I understood. And I felt no urgency, no need to accelerate what was coming, because the process was already complete in the ways that mattered. All that remained was for him to fully see it, to recognize that the structure he believed he could step away from and return to had already been redefined. And as I turned off the lights and let the darkness settle around me, I understood something with complete certainty. There was no going back, not for him, not for me, because once the truth has been acted upon, it does not wait for permission to exist, it simply becomes the new reality by the following day. The tension that had been building quietly between us finally reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken, not because I forced it into the open, but because Richard had run out of ways to avoid it, and I could see it in the way he moved through the house, no longer with assumption, but with hesitation, as if every step required confirmation that the ground beneath him was still stable. And that morning, he did not leave for work at his usual time. Instead he stayed, sitting at the kitchen table long after his coffee had gone cold, his hands resting flat against the surface as though he needed something solid to hold onto. And when I entered the room, he looked up immediately, no pretense left in his expression, no effort to soften what was about to be said, and he asked me directly what this meant, what I was planning, what was going to happen next, and for the first time since all of this began, I gave him a clearer answer, not detailed, not emotional, but precise enough that there could be no misunderstanding. I told him that I had already taken the steps necessary to protect my future, that I had ensured stability for myself regardless of his choices, and that what happened next was no longer something he could control by deciding when or how to be honest. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything we had experienced before, because it carried finality, not uncertainty, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had changed, not just financially, not just structurally, but fundamentally. And he asked one more question, quieter this time, asking if there was any way to fix this. And I held his gaze steadily, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm certainty that left no room for interpretation. And I told him that this was not something that had broken overnight, and it was not something that could be repaired by a single conversation. And as those words settled between us, I saw the realization take hold, the recognition that the version of our life he had been relying on no longer existed. And later that afternoon, he finally left the house, not with the usual routine confidence, but with a measured, uncertain step, as if he was no longer sure what he was leaving behind or what he would be returning to. And I watched from the window once more, not out of habit, but out of closure, because this time, it was not about waiting or wondering, it was about acknowledging that the shift was complete. And as the quiet filled the space again, I moved through the house with a different awareness, not as someone holding things together, but as someone standing in a place that now fully belonged to her. And when my phone lit up later that evening with a message from an unknown number, I already knew who it was before I read it, and the words were brief, uncertain, asking if we could talk, and I looked at the screen for a moment before setting it down, because whatever needed to be said had already been set in motion, and there was nothing left that required permission, explanation, or negotiation, only the steady continuation of a life that I had already chosen to rebuild on my own terms. The next few days unfolded with a quiet precision that no longer required my attention at every step, because everything that needed to be set in motion already had been, and for the first time in a long time, my focus was no longer on what Richard might do or say, but on what I would continue to build without him. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed the way the house felt entirely, no longer a place filled with tension waiting to surface, but a space that reflected clarity, intention, and control. And when he returned that evening, his presence carried a weight that had not been there before, not just uncertainty, but something closer to recognition, as if he had begun to understand that whatever version of the situation he had believed he could manage was no longer within his reach. And he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, taking in the room, the quiet, the distance that now existed between us without needing to be spoken aloud. And when he finally stepped inside, there was no attempt at casual conversation, no effort to return to routine. Instead he asked if we could talk, his voice lower, more measured, and I nodded, not because I was waiting for this moment, but because I had already decided how it would unfold. And we sat across from each other at the same table that had witnessed every stage of this unraveling, and he began to speak, not defensively, not with excuses, but with an attempt at explanation, offering fragments of truth that he had once hidden, acknowledging choices he had avoided naming. And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed to hear it, but because it no longer had the power to affect the decisions I had already made. And when he finished, there was a pause, not filled with expectation, but with the understanding that whatever came next would not return us to where we had been. And I told him calmly that I already knew enough, that the details no longer mattered, that what mattered was what had been done and what I had chosen to do in response. And I could see in his expression that he understood the difference, that this was no longer about uncovering the truth, It was about living with the outcome of it, and he asked again, more quietly this time, if there was any possibility of moving forward together, and I held his gaze, steady and clear, and told him that moving forward was exactly what I was doing, just not in the way he was hoping for, and the words settled between us with a finality that did not need to be emphasized, because it was already understood, and after that, there was nothing left to discuss, no argument to continue, no decision left to be made, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had already changed. And later that night, as he moved through the house gathering a few of his things, not everything, just enough to signal what was coming next, I remained where I was, not watching, not reacting, simply allowing the moment to pass as it needed to, and when the door closed behind him, the silence that followed was not heavy, not uncertain, but complete, because for the first time since this began, there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left waiting to be said or discovered, only the steady presence of a life that had been redefined with clarity, intention, and the quiet strength to follow through on every choice that had led to this moment. The first morning after he left did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning that had been waiting quietly beneath everything else, and as the light came through the windows, filling the house with a calm, steady brightness, I moved through each room without hesitation, without the weight that had once followed every step, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like something to endure, it felt like something I had chosen, something that belonged entirely to me, and I paused in the kitchen, resting my hand against the counter, noticing how different everything felt even though nothing had visibly changed. Because the difference was no longer in the space itself, it was in the absence of uncertainty, in the clarity that had replaced it, and as the day unfolded, I did not rush to fill the time, I let it move naturally, allowing myself to exist without constantly measuring what came next against someone else's choices. And later that afternoon, I stepped outside, standing on the front porch for a moment longer than usual, taking in the quiet street, the familiar surroundings that no longer felt tied to a version of my life that had ended, and I realized then that closure does not always arrive with dramatic moments or final words. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet certainty that there is nothing left to resolve. And in the days that followed, small changes continued to take shape, not out of necessity, but out of intention. The way I arranged the rooms, the way I organized my time, the way I allowed myself to think about the future without hesitation, and each decision, no matter how small, reinforced something simple and undeniable, that I was no longer reacting to a situation I could not control. I was actively building something that reflected who I had become through it, and one evening, as I sat by the window with the soft glow of the lights around me, my phone lit up once again with a message, this time longer, more deliberate, an attempt to reach back into something that no longer existed, and I read it carefully, not with anger, not with regret, but with the kind of distance that comes from understanding that some chapters close not because they are incomplete, but because they have already served their purpose, and I placed the phone down without responding, not as a rejection, but as a final acknowledgement that there was nothing left to say. And as the night settled in, bringing with it a quiet sense of completion, I leaned back, allowing myself to fully feel what had once seemed impossible, not relief, not triumph, but something steadier, something more lasting, a sense of self that no longer depended on what someone else chose to do. And in that moment, I understood that the story had never truly been about what was taken or what was lost. It had always been about what I was willing to see, what I was willing to change, and what I was willing to claim as my own. And now, standing at the edge of everything that had been and everything that would come next, I knew with complete certainty that I was no longer waiting for anything. I was already exactly where I needed to be.